Now, the Trump administration has released a plan to improve children's health. 128 recommendations address everything from vaccines to the type of milk served in schools. It's all part of Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy's push to make America healthy again. According to our next guest, some parts of the report are a cause for concern. Susan Main is an adjunct professor of epidemiology at Yale and the former director of the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition at the FDA. She joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss where she believes the strategy succeeds and where it falls short.
Deanna, thanks. Dr. Main, thanks so much for joining us. Just last week, Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. unveiled his Make America Healthy strategy document. It has 128 different recommendations in it. You're someone who's intimately familiar with how the FDA works, and you're now in public health. What were your first impressions?
My initial impressions, Hari, are that they've identified a really important public health problem in this country, and that is the problem of chronic disease. And it's not just a problem for our children, it's a problem for adults as well. Chronic diseases are the largest causes of death in this country, cardiovascular disease and cancer being number one and number two. In terms of the importance for me is that this report has really focused in on diet and nutrition as important modifiable risk factors for chronic disease. And that's an area I've been working on for the last 4 decades.
He said something that was interesting. He said he had a claim in there that says 76% of Americans are suffering from a chronic disease compared with 11% when my uncle was president. That statistic accurate?
I can't quote specific statistics, and it also depends on what you're including in terms of chronic disease. When I think about chronic disease, my work is on cancer and heart disease and obesity and diabetes. And yes, they have gone up in this country. Obesity has increased dramatically in this country, and many of those chronic diseases that I just spoke about are specifically related to obesity.
Okay, so one of the challenges has been that, if it's an acute health issue, we can try to treat it with medicine, we can try to have interventions, but for chronic diseases that take such a long-term impact on people, how do we, rewrite the ship, so to speak, our entire health infrastructure to deal with something that is kind of so intractable for so many millions of people?
I think the importance of the report is it does focus in on prevention, and prevention has been a hard area to really focus in on at the federal level because the dividends take a while to come in. But we know we have to prevent these chronic diseases, and for people who have chronic diseases, food and nutrition are important things to help manage those chronic diseases. There's really exciting research showing that you can even reverse diseases like type 2 diabetes with food, nutrition, lifestyle interventions. So it's a really important priority to focus in on prevention and management of chronic disease, and food and nutrition are really important tools to do just that.
When we talk about food and nutrition, one of the report's proposals is to define ultra-processed foods. And I guess we kind of have an idea of what that is, but why is it important to try to get a definition out?
It's really important to get a definition out. Ultra-processed foods have been very difficult to agree on what that definition should be. There have been definitions that have been used for research purposes, such as the NOVA classification, but we know they're overly broad. And the other thing that we know is that it tends to include foods as being ultra-processed that are actually not harmful for our health and may actually be beneficial, simply because they may include an additive, for example. So if the government wants to take a regulatory step on ultra-processed foods, they need to define what that means. States have tried to do that by saying, let's figure out what particularly harmful ultra-processed foods are. They tend to be the ones that we associate with junk foods, and people would agree that those are problematic. But what about whole wheat breads and cereals, for example, that are captured under the ultra-processed food categorization that actually are associated with reductions in risk of things like colorectal cancer?
That's interesting because each of the foods that might be kind of on this list or in this category would probably have a very powerful lobby trying to make sure that they're not legislated out or legislated or regulated into, whatever the rules are. I mean, decreasing ultra-processed foods was kind of one of the central ideas of the Secretary's supporters early in this administration. And I wonder, as I look through the strategy, I don't see that many specifics on exactly how to tackle it besides trying to define it.
And I would agree with you, and that was exactly my reaction as well. Clearly, there is a commitment to try to reduce ultra-processed foods in the United States, and you see language about providing healthy, whole foods to consumers across different sectors, from the Women, Infant, and Children program through the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance program, through veterans programs, et cetera. And so that's a laudable goal, to reduce consumption of ultra-processed foods and provide fresh, wholesome foods to people. The problem is there aren't clear policies in the report to do that. Moreover, there are resource ramifications. If we want to improve the quality of food that is provided by the federal government, that has cost implications. And instead, what we have seen during the Trump administration are the biggest cuts ever in our federal nutrition assistance programs. So the goals and the commitments really stand at odds with the resources. And you may have noted when you read the strategy, there aren't resource commitments in the report.
You know, when you talk about the supplemental nutrition program, this strategy document says it wants to get whole, healthy food to SNAP participants. Given the cuts to SNAP from the budget bill, how likely is that?
Zero, zero likely. If you cut these programs and you cut the resources, your ability to deliver whole, healthy foods is simply not going to happen. We've also seen some other cuts, not just to SNAP. For example, there were programs where farmers could get fresh produce into the school systems. Great programs that supported agriculture, supported healthy foods in schools. Those were also defunded. So it'll be interesting to see what resource commitments they'll be making going forward. But based upon what's happened so far, these goals will not be reached.
The original MAHA report from some months ago identified 4 potential drivers of childhood chronic diseases. It identified poor diet, aggregation of environmental chemicals, lack of physical activity, and chronic stress and over-medicalization. I mean, is that a fair assessment? Is that a decent sort of starting point to try to build a strategy around?
Well, my expertise is on the food and nutrition side, but what should be obvious is that many of the leading causes of death in our youth, such as firearm injuries, are not mentioned. Also, tobacco and alcohol are not addressed in the report specifically, and so those are important causes of chronic disease in our country as well. So there certainly are some things that are not mentioned in the report that public health officials would prioritize in such a report.
One of the things that this strategy tries to lay out, and I think that you have an expertise on, is sort of dietary guidelines. Is the United States going to revisit, so to speak, what we consider the bare minimum or the optimal type of diet that Americans should be having?
So I'm glad you asked me about the dietary guidelines. Just a little bit of background. They are issued every 5 years. That's required by Congress, and so that has to happen every 5 years. The process involves a very transparent, public-facing process. Research questions are identified, nutrition evidence reviews are prepared and consolidated. Public meetings are held. Then a Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee takes 2 years to review all that science and produce a scientific report called the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee Report. And that report was released near the end of the Biden administration. And that's the way it works. And then the federal government takes that report and comes up with the dietary guidelines for Americans. And so this administration needs to do that before the end of this year. We have heard Secretary Kennedy say that this should be forthcoming in the near future. What I am a little concerned about, though, is that some of the statements in the actual strategy about the dietary guidelines process are concerning. And they talk about revisiting the advisory committee. They talk about revisiting how that science is looked at and how the process unfolds. That process has been looked at over and over again with a lot of input from Congress, and I'm concerned that we may see some disruption to a very science-based, transparent process by the current administration, which we have seen with the Vaccine Advisory Committee, so that concerns me. The other point I'll make is that I fully expect that the dietary guidelines that will be coming may deviate from some of that science that is articulated in the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. And we've seen that in the strategy report. For example, language about removing restrictions on saturated fat, that was mentioned. We've also seen a higher profile to meat in the strategy report. It's mentioned several times in the strategy, but there's no mention of poultry or fish or plant proteins. So I think that foreshadows some of what we may be seeing coming with the dietary guidelines.
One of the other areas that I think you'd be qualified really to talk about is microbial food safety. I mean, we don't necessarily think about it. Unfortunately, we think about it only in the context of when something goes wrong, and we hear about a salmonella outbreak, or we hear about something on the news. But what are those kind of changes to this that you're concerned about?
It really has not received much attention from the current administration in terms of promoting that we need to do more here. Instead, what we have seen are steps by the administration that actually undermine microbial food safety. A few examples include dismantling an advisory committee that's been in existence called the National Advisory Committee for Microbiological Criteria in Food. They were working on a request that we put forward when I was at the FDA on how to prevent bacterial contamination of infant formula. That was because it led to the contaminated formula, led to the massive recall and infant formula shortages. So we had a committee working on that. That group was disbanded right before the release of that report, and it has not yet seen the light of day. We've also seen changes to our foodborne illness surveillance systems called FoodNet. That was our national surveillance system. They used to capture data on 8 different pathogens. They have now said they are reducing that to just 2, Salmonella and E. coli, because of lack of resources. So there are other changes as well, but I think that an important point is when we think about nutrition, we also really have to pay attention to food safety, and especially microbial food safety. Because if we're promoting things like fruits and vegetables and leafy greens and whole fresh foods, those are the same types of foods that are higher risk from a food safety perspective. And I've often heard people say to me, well, I'd rather go eat a bag of Doritos because I'm not going to get foodborne illness than have a salad. And we really need to address that. We need to prevent foodborne illnesses and contamination of these products. And it's really important to support a nutrition strategy. When I was at FDA, I led the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. So I got to look at that intersection of food safety and nutrition, and the two intersect quite frequently. So paying attention to food safety is important for nutrition as well.
Doctor, what's interesting is that, besides trying to make sure that the food that's going into our bodies is safe in the first place, there's also sort of the exposure from outside, right? I mean, how do we make sure that kids are not exposed to toxic chemicals and so forth? And I see in the strategy document, there's a lot of kind of emphasis on the EPA studying lots of things, including air pollution. But at the same time, we see that, the Office for Research and Development at the EPA has been shut down. So I'm a little confused as to how we would try to get to this healthier, happier place while the funds for some of the research that would be necessary to find the information don't exist anymore.
And you've identified some of the really stark contradictions between what's happening in the current administration and the stated goals in the strategy report. And I can give you one example of something I worked on at FDA, and that's contamination of foods with perfluorinated alkyl substances, or PFAS. And so PFAS get into the environment, they get into the water, they get into the soil, and then food can take that up, and we have contaminated food. So the only way to really address it is to address the environmental contamination. And we worked hard with EPA to set standards for PFAS in water, to try to reduce that environmental contamination. And what we're seeing in the current administration is those standards are being rolled back. So again, it's just another example where the goals in the report and the strategy, those goals are really spot on, but the actions the administration is taking are the opposite and are going to really impair their ability to meet any of those goals.
So how do we get from kind of this idea of a strategy document to actually implementing it? Let's take, for example, ultra-processed foods. If the definition is the only thing that the strategy is calling for, what do we do between now and whenever that time is?
That's a great question, because what I really think we need is urgent action right now on ultra-processed foods. It's going to take some time to come up with a definition that can be used for regulatory purposes, and we need action now. So what I would recommend is that they really focus in on the components of ultra-processed foods that we know are damaging to health. And I'm talking about things like too much sodium, too much added sugar, and too much saturated fat. So there are steps the administration could take right now. Continue promoting sodium reduction in our food supply. I've worked on that for the last several administrations, and progress has been made. Continue working on sugar reduction, saturated fat reduction. Front of pack nutrition labeling was proposed, but not yet finalized. So getting that information, interpretive labeling right on the front of packages. And I've mentioned some labeling ideas because labeling not only informs consumers, but it also drives industry to reformulate products to be healthier. When FDA mandated trans fat labeling on the nutrition facts label some years ago, exposure dropped by 80%. And that's because consumers started avoiding products with trans fat and industry reformulated. So there's many steps, these and others, that the government could certainly take right now to start addressing ultra-processed foods by dealing with the adverse nutritional composition of these foods and helping drive to a more healthful food supply.
How do we make sure that this is not just an aspirational statement? I mean, are there kind of low-hanging fruit where we could have some sort of bipartisan consensus of people saying, hey, let's go ahead and get behind this? I mean, we see when it comes to standing up new agencies, I mean, that's going to take actions of Congress to sort of fund something completely new. And so to my brain, it's like, well, that's going to take forever. So, or if at all, right?
Yeah, so you're kind of getting at how do we make sure that there's goals and metrics and accountability, and none of that's in the strategy. I would have loved to see something that says within 2 years we're going to drive down the sodium content of these foods, or we're going to reduce consumption in this country by addressing things like marketing or access through the supplemental nutrition assistance programs. There are steps that could have been communicated and metrics that we could hold them accountable for. And you mentioned bipartisan support. We do have bipartisan support from Congress to address the food supply in ways that we didn't have in previous administrations. And I can speak to my time in the Obama administration, where we certainly did not have bipartisan support. Despite that, we were able to ban partially hydrogenated oils, trans fats in food. We were able to get added sugars labeling on the nutrition facts label, and we were able to target too much sodium in our foods, and that was without bipartisan support. So I was expecting some really lofty goals and strategies and policies coming out of this document, potentially metrics, and it just wasn't there.
Dr. Susan Main, former FDA official and epidemiologist at Yale University School of Public Health. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Now, the Trump administration's immigration crackdown is just one example of the whirlwind changes in Washington this year, from aid and foreign policy to trade and beyond. Trump has upended U.S. doctrine, transforming institutions and redefining America's place in the world. Staff writer at The New Yorker, Susan Glasser, joins Michelle Martin to cut through the noise and identify the defining themes of the past 10 months.
Thanks, Paula. Susan Glasser, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
So obviously we've called you because you've followed, politics and policy in Washington and around the world for many, many years. What about this year stands out to you? And I know it's hard to pick because there have been so many consequential events this year, one after another. But when you just think about the year on the whole, what stands out to you?
Yeah, I mean, look, if the goal was to overwhelm, let's just say they're succeeding and then some. If anything, the year has been characterized by a level of disruption and even at times destruction in Washington that is something that I suspect we'll all be looking back to for a long, long time.
I'm thinking about, the first part of the year is that I don't even know what to call it. It's not an agency, this kind of ad hoc group led by Elon Musk, whose main projects seem to be to destroy, humanitarian aid around the world, as well as, federal agencies. And then, of course, the tariff policy, the mass pardoning of January 6th defendants on Inauguration Day, these moves to reshape the federal bureaucracy, particularly with an eye to things that have been disturbing to conservatives for years, like the Department of Education and things of that sort. Is there anything that constitutes a through line through all of that?
Yeah, that is, I think, important for us to try to reckon with. And as I think of it, in some ways, Trump 1.0, you could say, was the completion of what Trump's son-in-law called the hostile takeover of the Republican Party. And that was accomplished really, by a couple years into Trump's term, I would say, as figures like John McCain left the scene and were replaced by enablers or, supporters of Trump and his MAGA movement. I would say, if that was 1.0, Trump 2.0 is the hostile takeover of Washington and the turning of the executive branch of the U.S. federal government into an extraordinary personal platform for the expanded powers and reach or overreach, as the case may be, of one man. This is something that, again, I think we'll be studying for many decades to come, which is the incredible aggregation of power in the form of one man in the Oval Office, and the idea that the Congress has largely stepped aside, including even abdicating many of its constitutionally assigned functions. There was a moment recently that was so telling when President Trump said, I feel like I'm the Speaker of the House as well as the President, too. And in some ways, you can't argue with that. So again, this incredible accretion of personalized executive power in the presidency. We don't know yet to what extent, if at all, this Trump-appointed conservative majority in the Supreme Court may yet act to constrain him. We don't know yet whether the voters ultimately will rebuke this and restrain it or roll it back in the midterm elections. But for now, 2025 is the year that America got a different kind of presidency.
Of all the things that we're thinking about here, when you think about the year, there are things that are really visible inside Washington. There are things that are visible outside of Washington. What are the things you think that might be most visible outside of Washington?
He said that he was going to be the president who was going to bring back the economy, the president who was going to stop inflation, the president who was going to restore kind of the way things were before the COVID pandemic disrupted the U.S. and the world. And that, I think, is where it's pretty remarkable that he's lost the very people, arguably, who brought him back to the presidency. Those kind of non-frequent voters, the independents, the young people who thought, okay, well, things aren't going well, and I'm really unhappy about the state of things in the economy. I'm unhappy about how much I have to pay. And here we are, not even a year later. And in fact, Americans are even more upset about the state of the economy than they were a year ago when they elected Donald Trump to fix it. And, he promised a lot of things that he was going to do on day one. He promised he was going to settle the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. He hasn't done that. But most importantly, from the point of view, I think, of the American electorate, he promised that he was going to bring prices down on day one of his second presidency and restore the economy. Instead, where we are is we have essentially the same level of inflation now that we did a year ago when Donald Trump was campaigning against the Joe Biden economy. He said the 3% inflation at that time was literally like the worst inflation in the history of the world, which of course it wasn't. And it wasn't even the worst inflation in modern times in the United States. But nonetheless, Donald Trump campaigned against that level of inflation. A year later, we have 3% inflation, essentially the exact same numbers that we did on the eve of the election. And now Donald Trump is calling this an affordability crisis that's a Democratic hoax that's just not true. The electorate needs to suck it up and get over it. Very similar in some ways to the level of denial that we saw from the former President Biden.
Let's talk about immigration. His polls have declined, maybe not with his core supporters, because he's got a core group of supporters who seem to support him no matter what. But it does seem that there are a lot of people who are disturbed by the way his immigration policy is unfolding. You know, they're seeing these images of people, women being dragged from their cars. They're seeing parents being arrested in front of their kids when they drop them off. And how do you think this is playing? How do you assess how this is going?
Yeah, I think it's really important. It was something not only that Trump campaigned on, but was very much a mobilizing factor for his core supporters. And I remember very vividly being at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. And when he said mass deportation now, there were pre-printed signs, and it was one of the only things, aside from the mention of his name itself, that audience really went crazy for. They were absolutely stirred up and rallied by that. And they held up the mass deportation now signs. The other issue, by the way, that really seemed to energize that core group of supporters, it was any mention of like men playing women's sports or, you know, trans issues. Those were the two things that I think really crystallized the culture war as it played out in the 2024 campaign. So flash forward, he's executing on that. As you said, we're now living in this world of these kind of horrible shock videos, right? Do you avert your gaze? Do you feel that you need to look at them because it's what's happening in our country right now? I mean, it's a painful aspect of kind of the visual backdrop, if you will, to the Trump 2.0 presidency. You also mentioned Trump's declining poll numbers. And this, I think, is very significant. Again, as I'm looking for differences between the first term and the second term, Donald Trump in the first term was a very unpopular president. He was a historically unpopular president, the most unpopular since public polling was taken, consistently. What's different is that back in the first term, Trump was generally getting pretty good marks on things like the economy, even where he was seen as personally polarizing or unpleasant to voters. So they gave him more credit for at least delivering on the economy in some ways, even if they didn't like what kind of public persona he had and the polarization. Now, interestingly enough, Donald Trump is even more underwater in the polls on things like the economy than he is overall in his negative approval ratings. Gallup just found that Trump had the lowest numbers of his two presidencies, including a 60% disapproval rating, but even more disapproval on the economy, even on immigration, where broadly speaking, even many Democrats and independents had supported the idea of closing the border. Or making it less permeable. I think a lot of Democrats believe their own party screwed up and that Joe Biden screwed up as president, to be blunt, in sort of allowing out of control illegal migration into the country. And so while there was a residual support in the public, it's these tactics that you mentioned, Michelle, I think, that have really begun to cause a backlash. The idea that it's not just the criminal illegal migrants that Donald Trump initially told us that he was going to go after, but that it's reaching into, essentially peaceful civil society in ways that people do not support and did not expect.
The other interesting thing that's happened this week that is related to immigration is the national security strategy was released, and it cites immigration to Europe as a problem. The way it was described as, what is it, the erasure of civilization due to immigration. How do you understand that, and what does this tell us about Trump's kind of view of the relationship that he thinks the United States should have with the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, that is a pretty radical document. It's a pretty disruptive document. It has a worldview that is very, very incompatible with the worldviews of any modern president, whether Democrat or Republican. It essentially abdicates and sort of says we're moving on from the idea of the United States as this global superpower and guarantor of the liberal order. I'm old enough to remember when American presidents used to speak of exporting democracy to the world. Donald Trump is now talking about exporting right-wing racism to Europe, which is really something remarkable. As you might expect, this has occasioned an incredible amount of both backlash and, I think, really existential level soul searching among European leaders, because really, not just since the end of the Cold War, but since the end of World War II, it's this partnership between the United States and Western Europe that has been the anchor of global security in many ways. And what Donald Trump is saying is that, actually in my first term, I talked about pay more for the security. Now I'm saying, yeah, I'm not really in on the deal. And it tells you in many ways much of what you need to know, that the people who have reacted favorably to the new national security strategy of the United States of America is the Kremlin. And you have both the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, and the former president, Dmitry Medvedev, welcoming this national security strategy with open arms, saying that it was explicitly echoing what Russia itself has said about security. It talks about, ending a world in which NATO is continuing to expand. It talks about the U.S. essentially destabilizing the governments that it doesn't like of many of its Western European allies and working from within those countries to depose those leaders. I mean, that's just a remarkable statement. It led one senior European I spoke with this week to say, my concern isn't so much anymore that the United States is not on this, not working to help Ukraine and Europe, but that the United States is now actively switching sides. And that's number one. Number two, I think this is very important, is that Trump in his campaign and in his first year of his presidency now has advanced a pretty radical notion of national security in which the U.S. basically is focused mostly on the Western Hemisphere, kind of a spheres of influence, almost a 19th century view of carving up the world with the other powers like Russia and China, but also that it should operate with impunity, basically, within the Western Hemisphere, and that they're defining national security threats as coming from, quote, the enemy within. That's something Trump said on the campaign trail. It's something that he repeated, and Pete Hegseth, his Secretary of Defense, repeated in that remarkable convening of America's general officers in Quantico. He basically said we should use the U.S. military on the streets of our own cities, and that it's actually domestic disturbances that pose a national security threat. And as you know, of course, he's kind of started to follow through on that by deploying troops to American cities on made-up pretext of crime waves and political disturbances that don't really exist, and over the objections of those cities' elected leadership. So it's not just about words anymore, Michelle. I think that's the key point.
The president's, how can we put this, seems to be very committed to enriching himself, if I can put it that way, in this current administration. I mean, in his first term in office, he said that he'd put his holdings into a blind trust. But in this administration, in this current term, there doesn't seem to be much concern about appearances of conflicts. It doesn't seem to be much concern about whether his policies dovetail particularly nicely with his own personal financial interests. Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought this up because I believe that it is very important. The levels of self-enrichment and the mobilization of the U.S. presidency as a tool for the enrichment of Donald Trump and his family is a really remarkable aspect of this second term. And again, the scale and scope of that enrichment, we are talking billions of dollars that are coming into the pockets of the Trump family and those in his inner circle.
And how is that working? How is that happening? And is that visible to the public? Is that the kind of thing that the public can see?
Yeah,
if they're interested.
Yeah, there's been incredible investigative reporting that has produced some really eye-popping examples. For example, Donald Trump's sons and Steve Witkoff's sons, Witkoff being his personal golfing buddy, real estate developer, turned peace envoy both to the Middle East and Russia. At the same time, the Trump family and the Witkoff family are doing business with the Arab Gulf Emirates at the same time that they're negotiating major international accords and actually twinning these things so that Trump and his family are talking about deals, billions of dollars invested in a new crypto company run by the Trump kids and the Witkoff kids. At the same time, Trump and Witkoff were in the Middle East for the first foreign visit of Donald Trump's second term. That's one example of many. There are new Trump real estate developments in countries around the world, Trump branded real estate developments in countries around the world that have major business with the Trump administration. He hosted the people who gave money to a Trump crypto enterprise for dinner at his club outside Washington, D.C., and then brought them in for a personal tour of the White House. So, again, it's the commingling that is really remarkable. We know, for example, that the Saudi government entities basically gave $2 billion in seed money to Jared Kushner's new investment fund at the end of Trump's first term. Well, did all that money come from Saudi Arabia? Maybe it's coming from other foreign entities. The answer is that we don't know.
Susan Glasser, thank you so much for talking with us again.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Now, the 2024 election showed more and more Black, Latino, and Asian Americans turning to Trump. It's been puzzling experts ever since. A professor at Yale may have an answer to the diversity emerging in the MAGA base. Daniel Martinez-Hosang joins Michelle Martin to explain the politics of the multiracial right.
Thanks, Christiane. Professor Daniel Martinez-Hosang, thank you so much for talking with us.
Oh, such a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation today, Michelle.
Yeah, likewise. So you've been writing about race and politics for a long time now. A lot of us follow your work. You recently wrote a really eye-catching piece for the New York Times where you explored the rise of a multiracial conservative movement in the United States. And this is something that people have talked about for a long time. I mean, a lot of people kind of felt was overblown, or they felt it was episodic, or they felt it was tied to, say, a specific movement. What do you think you add to the conversation with your piece?
Part of what I was trying to say is that for this piece, we know that in the last election, the estimates are something like 45 to 50% of Latino voters cast their ballot for Trump. Maybe 40% of Asian American voters. Black support for Trump is much less, but it, by some estimates, doubles from the previous election. And as you said, many people imagine, well, was there an ad there? Was it a candidate choice? Was it, a different show someone, Kamala Harris should have gone on? And part of what I wanted to lay on this piece is that this is a much longer and deeper and really more structural story. When people are talking about what led them to this place where they identify as conservative, they might support Trump, some even identify as kind of MAGA folks, there is a longer story behind that. It's not just tied to one election. And I think even folks who do not agree with these politics, the positions they hold, it is so important to understand those deeper experiences.
And one of the reasons that this stands out is that, Barack Obama. I mean, the fact is, his first election and his second put together this multiracial coalition. So obviously, you've talked about the appeal we're going to talk more about this, the appeal of Donald Trump. But is it primarily the appeal of Donald Trump or the appeal of a movement, or is it a kind of disillusionment, disdain with the Democrats? I guess the question is, did Republicans win or did the Democrats lose?
Yeah. So, it's a little of both. And I think it's so important, Michelle, to go back to 2012, because at that moment, we're talking about something like 80% of voters of color, Black, Asian American, Latino voters who cast a ballot are supporting Barack Obama. Even at that time, the Republican the RNC says we're in deep danger. We've lost 2 elections in a row. all our focus groups and polling are telling us it feels like we're out of touch. Young voters of color find us kind of stuck in the past. If we don't kind of modernize our image, our accessibility, we are doomed. This is Republicans saying that. And
they had a whole project around this. It was led by Ed Gillespie, a former Republican chief of staff. It was, what did they have a name for it? Like an autopsy?
It was the autopsy report.
The autopsy, which is kind of dire. But
I just, this is not that long ago. This is less than 15 years ago. And they're saying like, we are doomed politically. And I think that was the sensibility, which is that the kind of demography is destiny. The electorate continues to change, and that can only benefit in a partisan way the Democrats. And so
what happened?
Well, yes. So, I mentioned in the piece, like Obama's inauguration, because the theme in 2012, it was all about optimism. Our best days are in front of us. We have so much to look forward to and give. But, scratch the surface there. The foreclosure and housing crisis, which had been underway for 3 or 4 years, it devastated communities of color in even more dramatic ways than, even kind of white working class and conservative voters. The opioid and addiction and healthcare crisis that started in some parts of the country within 4 years was in every city. So you just saw, and then we have COVID. So there was some, voters kept describing to me, it's not that I was opposed to the soaring rhetoric and the symbolism. I was drawn to that. A good number of folks I interviewed who were on the right today said, I voted for Obama. Several said I volunteered for his campaign. I was so excited. But in the next 4 years, I did not see anything change. And my sense of the disconnect between the talk and the action in my own neighborhood grew and grew and grew. And so many people noted that.
One of the people you interviewed, Sam Gonzalez, identifies as a gay Latino man. And he had voted Democrat before. But here's again why this is so fascinating, because so many people identify Donald Trump in particular and the sort of Trumpism or the MAGA movement as being anti-Latino, hostile to immigrants, and increasingly hostile to gays, transgender people who are part of the LGBTQ movement. So what happened? What's Sam Gonzalez's story? What was the appeal for him?
So this is the Rio Grande Valley, South Texas, which for generations had been just a staunchly and reliably Democratic, largely Latino, Mexican-American voting base. And part of what I, traced out is that wasn't just, their kind of independent attitudes or preferences. There was real organization there. There's, unions and civic organizations and local Democratic parties and radio stations. And so many people said that's why for just generations, we never thought about Republicans. It's very important to understand after 2012, the right started to pick up on new opportunities in these communities. They started sending organizers. They started knocking on doors. The Koch network, Libertarian Network, created this Libre initiative to start connecting with people. So that sense that people have no other alternatives, which for generations had been true, wasn't true. The second thing is with someone like Sam, part of what he said is like, I am a proud gay man. I'm proudly Latino. But that doesn't mean that that's my only way that I think about myself politically. He says, I'm also Christian. That also shapes how I think about gender, how I think about religion and faith. And his sense was there's assumptions among the Democrats that if you just look at him and say he's a gay Latino man, these are the policy preferences. What Sam is describing is true for many more people than we acknowledge. We sometimes talk about it now as having heterodox politics, mixing and matching around immigration, around gender, around work, around security, etc. They don't just neatly fall into left-right categorizations.
Some people identify the attraction of some of these voters to Donald Trump because of sexism. He presents as a very sort of traditional male. I'm rich, I'm loud, I'm unapologetic, I do what I want. Yeah. And some people sort of identify the appeal to some, particularly Black men, as being part of that. What did you find in your reporting?
I mean, we certainly cannot underestimate the role of patriarchy, gender politics, and attraction to that. I wouldn't, dismiss it in any way. I will say, though, that I don't think that explains all or even most of what we're seeing. Many of the folks I talked to, again, talked about, in a place like Milwaukee where schools, public funding, access to services, they've just been decimated across the last 2 decades. That's what people were repeatedly talking about, like my neighborhood, the sense of, safety, other kinds of things. And for them, in part just of the kind of two-party system and how it's often Democratic leaders who have had, are in charge of governance of multiracial cities. The blame for that is going to be put at the feet of the Democrats. They're saying, we've tried to redress, and nothing seems to change. And again, in a two-party system, this is the only alternative.
How do they explain the fact that the way that Donald Trump expresses himself, often people experience as anti-Blackness?
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, like, how some of the people you talk to, how do they deal with that? How do they think about that?
Yeah. I mean, first, I just want to say, just to acknowledge, right, like Donald Trump, he insulted and denigrated, civil rights icon John Lewis. He talked about a city like Baltimore as kind of broken, trash. He used profanity to talk about African countries and immigrants.
Not to mention the first campaign talking about immigrants from, Mexico in particular, Latin America in general, as being, criminals as a
criminals
group.
And predators.
They're not sending our best. They're not sending their best, And
then, the Springfield, Ohio and the eating cats, and right, it's just never ending. But I'll say in these conversations, the voters that I talked to, how they would respond, and just to imagine how they'd respond to this important question, would say, I don't take that seriously. I don't think he's it's being distorted and misrepresented. They're trying to use it to score political points. And I actually don't really care about that kind of back and forth. So they say, to me, it's a little bit of theater and performance. I'm focused on what's going to make a change. The other thing is many people said, look, as a Democrat, I've also tolerated a lot of, from their perception, liberal racism from Democrats that they find condescending and patronizing. So the idea that once you get a taste of how much they dislike you, you'll realize, something right. I think Black voters especially have long navigated a Democratic Party that has been also ambivalent about them and has shown, remorse and distaste and tolerated conditions that didn't honor their dignity. So, people might also just stay there in those complex ways and try to see what still might be possible versus saying, gosh, this was all, I've been hoodwinked. I'm going to go back to some other place where people will honor me. I talked to most of these folks after inauguration in those first 90 days when, remember, Michelle, there was just these dramatic changes, Department of Education, right? All these agencies shut down. And I said, well, is this what you wanted? And almost every person said he's doing what he said he would, which is he's an outsider. He's disrupting the status quo. He's rooting out the perceived corruption, et cetera. So I just think that, and just as the last thing I'll say, to remember, right, the week before the election, there was a Trump rally in Madison Square Garden. A comment said, made this comment about Puerto Rico as comparing it to garbage. Yeah, immediately people said, well, there goes his support among Puerto Rican voters. But the next day, I was talking to a journalist in Pennsylvania, and he's saying there's tons of Puerto Rican flags here. People continue to support it. So part of what they think is it's both not serious, he's not really talking about me, and this is just kind of what his opponents are doing to try to discredit him.
What about Asian American voters? Talk about that.
So like Latino voters, this is a really, really diverse group, lots of different experiences. The dramatic growth in the Asian American electorate also means, again, lots of different occupations and things that are shaping, it's not just about education or access to the Ivy Leagues. There's many things. I talked to a group of mostly Chinese American voters in San Francisco. What was really foremost on their mind, especially those who had very small mom and pop shops, was a sense of order and safety, and they run on very, very small margins. Could they open their store so that they could just make enough to pay the rent? And San Francisco as a city, like many others, has a profound housing affordability crisis. It has an addiction crisis that's just spilled everywhere. So there's a sense that there's these colossal problems, and there's very, very few Republicans who are representing those voters. So again, it's Democrats who get caught with the kind of you haven't done anything about it. And that's partly what, for a lot of those voters, it's actually not their experiences with communism or authoritarianism in their home countries. It's wanting to fix things. Yeah, it's local.
The question I have is that I take your point that a lot of the people you interviewed, they want to change. They're tired of the status quo and they want to change, and Trump represents change. What happens if he doesn't deliver?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say two things there. One is I think that there's a whole set of voters who don't wake up every morning thinking about what the legislation is, what its impact was, et cetera. And so they're not going to see it in a kind of cost benefit way. And Trump is so skilled at continually producing, demons, people who are culpable, et cetera. So as long as that churn kind of keeps going, I think he feels like even in a place where he hasn't delivered promises about everything that's going to change, he still benefits. The other thing, part of this work, we've gone to a lot of right-wing conferences, including this group Turning Point USA has a big conference in Phoenix every year. You'll see them very accurately talking about problems and challenges in people's lives. You will rarely hear them talk about solutions. And I think it's because they've picked up on something. People are exhausted, they're lonely and isolated, they want some acknowledgement that that's a real feeling. Their sense that you could actually do something is an open question. And that's the space they're kind of inhabiting, if that makes sense.
I mean, there used to be a kind of a broad sense of identity among certain groups. Is there a bigger issue around identity with people of color in this country where that just isn't as foregrounded in their lives?
Yeah, I think what's happened is precisely what you're saying. I would say for a generation of Latino voters, that was often true as well. Even if I'm a citizen, I'm not from a mixed status household, if they're talking about them, they're talking about all of us. There was a really important poll done by the New York Times and Siena College in the fall, and it asked all these Latino voters, when Donald Trump is talking about immigrants, do you think he's talking about you? A majority said, no, he's not talking about me. And so I think that sense of both, you're talking about the kind of lumping, but there's also that splitting, right? There's a them and an us within all of these communities. And I think that's partly what he's been effective at speaking to. And he will say, I believe in you. I believe in your work ethic, your faith, your ability, your love for family. That's who I believe in. All these other corrupt forces, they don't believe in you. I believe in you. So that's the other thing I've seen is it's not a de-emphasizing of identity or even cultural pride.
On the other hand, we've seen this, for example, mass deportation scheme, ensnaring people who, are not immigrants, some who are citizens, some who have been here for decades. And so the question I have is, conversely, could the way President Trump is going about implementing some of these policies, even though they were attractive to voters, be causing buyer's remorse? Particularly among some of these people who are newly part of this coalition.
Yeah. I think there's no doubt, and I think it's reflected in more recent polling among Latino Trump supporters, that it has dampened and their enthusiasm and support, and it's not in line with their understanding of what a fair immigration enforcement is. So absolutely. But we also can't underestimate some sense that there are a significant number of folks who identify as immigrants, immigrant families, who also are persuaded by robust enforcement practices. And the Republicans are trying to find what that line is. But the idea that just the specter and the scare of these raids alone will move everyone back, I think on the ground it's going to be more complex.
Is there any hope for Democrats?
I actually think in some ways these people that move to the right, they actually have some hope. They're not the folks who are just altogether withdrawing. They're actually wondering, well, maybe there is some other possibility here. So that's what I found, encouraging, is that people want that. They want dignity for themselves. I actually didn't hear a lot of people just rehashing the same attacks on neighbors and you kind of hear that from the stage, but I don't think that's the world people want to live in. And I think the rebuilding process happens at the local level when people can kind of see that trust in action. It's not just about drafting a new candidate or figuring out one new podcaster to fix this. It's really doing what the generation before did, building this local infrastructure of connection and hope and possibility and love that people feel connected to. That's where I think there's real opportunity.
Professor Daniel Martinez-Hosang, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks, Michelle. Such a delight to talk to you.
Next to Silicon Valley, where major U.S. tech firms are urged to stop exports to the Chinese police, with some lawmakers asking that they appear before Congress. Now, this comes after a recent Associated Press investigation revealed the direct role the U.S. companies have played in building Beijing's mass surveillance state. AP reporter Date Kang investigated this story, and he joins Hari Srinivasan to talk about the complicity of American technology.
Bianca, thanks. Investigative reporter Date Kang from the Associated Press, thanks so much for joining us. You had a recent piece that uncovered a layer of surveillance that's going on in China that had been previously unreported. But you, in your report, through documents that were handed over from a whistleblower, found connections to American companies. What did you find?
Yeah, basically what we found in these documents is that, in the past, there's been reporting about how American companies have provided components or products to the Chinese police. But what we found is that actually these American companies not only sold some goods to the Chinese police, they actually were complicit in designing the entire system from the top down and working very closely with the Chinese authorities in building the system. And so when you look at, the Chinese policing apparatus as it is today, it wouldn't have existed without the assistance of American companies. From the very beginning, back 25 years ago, American companies were there right at the start, designing and building these systems to a large degree so that the Chinese police could carry out government repression, censorship, and control of its own people.
You write, quote, some directly pitch their tech as tools for Chinese police to control citizens. Marketing material from IBM, Dell, Cisco, and Seagate show their sales pitches made both publicly and privately cited Communist Party catchphrases on crushing protests, including stability maintenance, key persons, and abnormal gatherings, and named groups that stifle dissent, such as Internet Police, Sharp Eyes, and the Golden Shield. What's the Golden Shield?
Yeah, so the Golden Shield is basically China's digital policing apparatus. When it got started, it was a way of kind of getting a hold of the internet. The internet was this thing that the Chinese authorities saw as being uncontrollable. Anyone could just go log on online and say whatever they wanted. And so the Chinese authorities wanted some way to be able to control it. And then from that project came this whole digital policing apparatus. They saw that the Chinese government had this need for digital censorship and surveillance, and they pitched their products for the Golden Shield, for the use of the Chinese police. And, some of the companies, they kind of vary in what they were selling. Some companies say, oh, we were just only selling hard drives, or we were just selling kind of, general purpose equipment and stuff like that. But when you actually look at these marketing materials, you find that a lot of these companies were very well aware of what their products were going to be used for. Some of the most damning material that we found was actually these classified government blueprints that show that IBM actually worked with a Chinese military and defense contractor to build out the Golden Shield Phase 2. And in those blueprints, you can actually see them say things like, consolidate Communist Party rule. You see these documents that, you see databases that show that they're monitoring people like, followers of dissident religious groups, or people in the far western region of Xinjiang, where many Western governments say that there was a genocide, and so you see these documents, and you see that these companies were actually quite active in pitching their gear to the Chinese police, and this is something that continues all the way up until quite recently, even though there's been repeated warnings about the way the Chinese police were using this kind of technology. And so, if you dig into these marketing materials, sometimes you see references to race. One post we found from Dell advertised, all race recognition with one of their facial recognition powered laptops. They're talking about things like blacklisted individuals, key personnel, which is this term that they use to track people that they think are politically sensitive. So a lot of American companies in the past have basically claimed ignorance. They say, oh, we don't really know how our gear is being used. We don't really have any control over that. But what our article shows is that that's not the case.
For the record, IBM says if older systems, because some of these contracts were back in the early 2000s, if older systems are being abused today and IBM has no knowledge that they are, the misuse is entirely outside of IBM's control, was not contemplated by IBM decades ago, and in no way reflects on IBM today. So, in your story, you said that the Xinjiang government has said, we are using these technologies to prevent and combat terrorist and criminal activity. There is absolutely no such thing as large-scale human rights violations. Does that ring true, considering what you've seen on the ground?
Absolutely not. I've gone to Xinjiang personally, almost half a dozen times, and I've seen people, be ordered into lines and having their phones checked personally. I've seen, particularly members of the Uyghur ethnicity being singled out, while members of China's Han majority ethnicity are kind of waved through security checkpoints. And so, the Chinese government has obviously gone on this big push to promote what it's doing in Xinjiang as being about combating terrorism, because they realized that this was damaging their reputation.
You have in your story this description of what's called basically a digital cage. Explain to our audience what that is. And you profile a family, but you say that this might affect up to 100,000 human beings in China. What's a digital cage? How does it work?
What the digital cage is that there's all these kind of invisible digital electronic systems that are kind of in place that are able to monitor and in some cases control the movement of the Chinese people. And for the vast majority of Chinese people, this is not a problem because, most people are not explicitly political. They're not going on the streets or, chanting or doing anything along those lines. And so these systems are not aimed directly at them. But the moment you do something that catches the state's attention for whatever reason, you say something against the party or whatever it is, then all of a sudden you might get blacklisted. And then if you're blacklisted, all of a sudden your life can totally change, right? You have police suddenly following you around, or you try to buy train tickets and then you get intercepted on the other side where there's officers waiting for you. I know this very well myself because as a journalist, I'm also a person that the state does monitor very closely. Obviously, I'm not in the same situation because they treat me with a certain degree of deference, knowing that I'm a foreign journalist. But there's the sense that you're always being watched and that, at any time the authorities could intervene in the situation. And what, this kind of digital policing is actually invisible to most people. And that's actually what makes it so insidious. It's repression, but it's invisible repression.
What are some of the human costs of this? I mean, what's the consequence to some of the people that you've been talking to in your stories?
This is something that I would really like to, I hope comes across in the story, is that this surveillance, it may not be prison, it may not necessarily be torture directly, but it's a form of psychological torture. That's the way a lot of my interviewees phrased it. Right. I mean, just the sense of just constantly being watched and monitored, it can turn you into a social pariah. I mean, one of the interviewees in our piece is basically a prisoner in his own home. He's basically stuck at home. Every time he goes out, there's police officers following him. They might tell him not to go certain places. His own family, they're freaked out by the officers constantly following them. And they've cut off all contact with him, right? And so, for people who are targets of this digital policing apparatus, I mean, it really extracts a huge toll. And the moment you end up crossing the line in any way, then they can come after you and they can arrest you. And then they have all of this information that they've compiled on you that lists out, what you've done wrong, and then they can end up putting you in prison. Sometimes there's things like police officers following you, and then when you do something they don't like, even if it's technically legal, they end up beating you up. That's something that one of the interviewees in our story faced. He was beaten by bricks by the police, and he ended up in the hospital. But even when he was in the hospital, there were officers that were outside his hospital ward, inside, hanging a surveillance camera above his face on an IV drip. I mean, it's really surveillance to an extreme.
So you point out in your reporting that it's not just IBM that sold their software into China in the first place decades ago. You said, here it's that Oracle, Hewlett-Packard, ArcGIS, developer of Esri, sold hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of geographic and mapping equipment and software to Chinese police. NVIDIA and Intel, the chip companies, have partnered with Chinese surveillance companies to add AI capabilities to cameras used for video surveillance. Other companies like Intel, Thermo Fisher, Motorola, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, Western Digital, and it's an enormous list of companies you're talking about. And before I let you answer here, you point out that Oracle, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and tech conglomerate Broadcom, which acquired VMware and cloud company Pivotal in 23, did not comment on the record. HP, Motorola, and Huawei did not respond. IBM, Dell, Cisco, Intel, Thermo Fisher, and Amazon Web Services all said they adhere to export control policies. Seagate and Western Digital said they adhere to all relevant laws and regulations where they operate. And then Esri denied involvement but did not reply to examples. Microsoft told AP it found no evidence that it knowingly sold technology to the military or police as part of updates to the Golden Shield. So what kind of software did they sell? Are they possibly maintaining?
Yeah, some companies, they're actually actively marketing to the Chinese police for the purposes of the control of their own people, right? So that, in that particular case, companies might say, we didn't really know how our gear was being used, but the marketing material there says otherwise, right? Another thing that this really tells you is that there's a really wide variety of companies that are involved, right? I mean, Thermo Fisher, for example, what they're selling is actually DNA testing kits and things like that. They were actually explicitly marketing the ability of their test kits to also test members of China's Uyghur and Tibetan ethnicities as well, right? And so what you see here is that you really have like a broad array of American tech companies. They all kind of rushed into China, in the early 2000s because they saw China as being this huge untapped market. A lot of them ignored warnings about how that technology was being used, and then they end up, selling, often knowingly, to the Chinese police for purposes of repression.
There's a response from NVIDIA that kind of begs a different question. NVIDIA says, look, it does not make surveillance systems or software. It does not work with police in China, has not designed the H220 chip for police surveillance, and relationships with Chinese surveillance firms no longer continue. I mean, there's this argument that tech companies are going to make that, look, I'm selling a general use technology, right? A chip is a chip. You could put it in your phone. You could put it in your graphics processor and play video games with it. You could use it for AI and large language models. You can't penalize us for that. That's not what we're doing. NVIDIA is in kind of a special case where the US government is going to take 15% of any chip sales that it makes to China, right? What's the danger here?
Yeah, so NVIDIA is a really interesting case, as you point out, because chip companies like NVIDIA and Intel will make the argument that they really can't control where their chips go. The thing about that, though, is that we found evidence that both NVIDIA and Intel actively partnered with Chinese surveillance companies for policing applications. And in NVIDIA's case, they actually worked with a Chinese police research institute. They were testing facial recognition software with NVIDIA chips. And so what you're seeing here is that these companies are, on the one hand, saying they're not explicitly being designed for the purposes of surveillance, but they're very much assisting companies in figuring out how their chips can be used for surveillance applications. And so, we grilled them about it. I mean, we pointed to specific relationships that they had with specific Chinese companies. In many of the cases, they kind of dismissed them, saying, that was in the past. After the US government sanctioned those Chinese companies, we no longer have any business ties with them. But some partnerships with other companies continue. I mean, we saw in the case of NVIDIA that they actually touted how two Chinese companies who do sell to Chinese police were using NVIDIA chips. And so that really begs the question. I mean, are they just adhering to the letter of the law, not the spirit of it? they say, all the American companies that we spoke to say that they comply with U.S. export controls. But what we're seeing is that they're really kind of walking right up to the line of what is permissible. We did not find, hard evidence of violation of export controls. Export controls are very complicated. But in a lot of these cases, what these companies are doing is that they're actively working with these Chinese surveillance companies so long as they're not being sanctioned. And so, even though these chips are not being designed for the purposes of surveillance, they still very much end up in surveillance applications and with the assistance of these chip companies.
Since you've published your report, senators like Josh Hawley from Missouri have said, look, maybe these companies need to be summoned in front of Congress, because there seem to be fairly sizable loopholes inside the existing export laws that enable this to happen. And this, from what you're showing here is that it's not just kind of the activists that are complaining, and it's not just Democrats, but there seems to be some kind of a bipartisan consensus that this kind of behavior needs to be regulated.
Absolutely. This has been an issue for decades, right? There's been congressional hearings about this since the mid 2000s. But every time, members of Congress or people in the US government have tried to do something about this to close those loopholes, there's been pushback from American tech companies. So they spend a lot of money lobbying on the issue, ensuring that bills that could potentially close the loophole never come to a vote. You have all these bureaucratic procedures. The Department of Commerce is responsible for export controls, and they've actually tried numerous times to close some of these loopholes, but they've always ended up running out of time and facing opposition before they're actually able to put through those changes. And so this has been a long-standing issue, absolutely a bipartisan one.
It's worth noting that the White House and Department of Commerce, did not respond to your request for comment in this story. One other idea that it was fascinating in your piece is that right now your piece focuses on the influence that American technology companies had on the surveillance that's happening in the Chinese state, and that Chinese companies could have advanced that technology further. But what's also interesting is that you also point out that, look, this type of surveillance is being used well beyond China, that there is facial recognition software that's being used, whether it's on the southern border of the United States or in Gaza by Israel, right?
Absolutely. One of the things that we really wanted to emphasize in writing this report is that this is not just a China problem. I think a lot of people tend to think of, China as being this kind of digital totalitarian state. There's a lot of discourse about that, right? But it's not just a China issue. And in fact, I think it's quite telling that it was American companies that brought a lot of this technology to China, because that means that it's also an American problem. And that's something that one of our interviewees actually said when she was speaking with us. She said, right now it might be us Chinese that's suffering, but sooner or later, Americans and people from other countries will suffer the consequences as well.
Investigative reporter with the Associated Press, Dave Kang, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Since launching to fame through popular American sitcoms Cheers and Frasier, award-winning actor Kelsey Grammer has built a celebrated career across TV, film, and Broadway. But behind the scenes, the star has suffered some great personal losses, including the rape and murder of his beloved younger sister, Karen. Grammer speaks to Michelle Martin about his memoir, laying bare his journey toward healing his pain and trauma. And just a note, this conversation contains some graphic details.
Thanks, Bianna. Kelsey Grammer, thank you so much for talking with us.
Pleasure to be here.
It's wonderful to meet you as yourself. So many people probably think they know you. You were on the air for so long as Dr. Frasier Crane, one of the longest running characters, if not the longest running character in television history. So many awards, so many accolades. So I was just wondering what that must have been like for you, for so many people to think they know you, but they couldn't possibly know you because they couldn't possibly have known what you were carrying with you.
Well, Michelle, that's a good question. Thank you. I think, I understand that there's a great value in it and a great reward in it that people find are so familiar with you on a at least on a presentational level. they think they recognize you because, of course, what they're seeing on television is some semblance of you, some reality. You're not very good at this stuff unless you've connected to a kind of a truthful characterization that people can recognize. So that they recognize, and that then breeds familiarity. That's not contempt, but it's actually just sort of gracious and generous toward you. But they don't know the specifics. They just have a good feeling. So they feel like you've been in their living room for so long, you're a friend.
Oh, that's good. I see your point. So it's a gift. It's more of a gift than a burden.
Absolutely.
It is? Okay.
Yeah.
This book is it's called Karen. It's about your sister, and it's about the way she died, but it's also about who she was and who she was to you. So could we just start there? Like, who was she to you?
She was the most important part of my life. She was my greatest love. I mean, until, of course, I got older and, rededicated my affections to another human being outside of that relationship, my relationship with my sister. It was an extraordinary closeness we had. We had such a magnificent sort of childhood, adolescence together, young adulthood together. That was remarkable.
I guess what I took from the book was that you were able to kind of let her know how important she was to you. But she was taken from you in an awful, awful way. And I mean, it's just, your description of it is horrific. You went back and actually read the police report, and you even went back to the place where she was abducted from before she was kidnapped and raped and murdered. And I just, and you lived with this for a long time. And I was wondering what made this the right time to write this book and to explore all the complexity of that. Why now?
There's a quotation in the book, in several places I refer to the Hamlet line about the readiness is all. I wasn't ready. For whatever reason, it didn't present itself to me as something I should or could do. And then the simple request to tell Karen's story turned into a book. I just jotted down some notes 3 years ago, maybe a little more than 3 years now, and realized about 8 pages in that I was going to be writing a book, and that it needed to be responsible and honest and uncover everything I could possibly think of. That's why the police report became important. It's also why it became important to go back and trace her steps, because I wasn't there when it happened. And the brother in me, the brother in me had to go because I couldn't before. And that's who I am. I needed to see her. I needed to see where she died. I needed to hold her in my creative imagination and to see her off in some way. And the book succeeded in doing that as well.
I can see that you lived with that guilt for a long time and not being able to protect her.
Yeah.
And I am sure that some listening to this conversation, be they men or women, but I can particularly understand as a brother why you would feel that way.
Older brother, older sister, you look at your siblings as your responsibility. You just do. If you're a human, it's like that sort of just comes along for the ride. So, yeah.
How do you think living with this loss influenced your trajectory as an artist?
Interesting, yeah. It probably encouraged me to take risks, to not suffer fools a lot, even though I'm a very kind man. I mean, but eventually I'll roll my eyes and say, I got to get out of here. It's like, no, I've had enough of this. But most of the time, I'm a very patient man, but with a focus on getting the job done. I like to get in the middle of things. I like to get into the fray. I like to fight it out. That probably is what I was given by virtue of losing Karen in a lot of ways. It was I'm not gonna waste this life.
I just want to say here that I'm really sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
It's just such a profound thing, and any having just experienced that in one loss, but you've had many. I mean, your father was murdered. And then later, you lost other siblings in a diving accident. One of the things that I've noticed about loss is that it brings you into connection with other people who've had loss. But you can also see where a person might not want to feel those things anymore.
Yeah.
You might think, what would be great? I could be an accountant and do people's taxes.
Feeling for me is just one of those important things to do. It's just, it was kind of who I was before Karen died. So, I discovered this, but that was because of the loss of my grandfather. That was when Gordon died, the whole world ended as far as I was concerned. And then I had to rebuild one. And we kind of had to do that together. And so I found that emotional outlet and realized that was probably the path to my success and my freedom in a lot of ways, was to live in emotion. So could I have done without this one? Yeah. Because I also believe that, if you're a good actor, you dive into the creative sort of imagination of a situation, and that response is probably just as honest as if you really lived it, because you've got a great imagination, and just has equal authority to someone who's actually been through that. So you can loan your imagination to a character and be just as authentic as if you had actually lived it.
I'm just wondering what it meant to you because family is obviously so important to you, to play the same character for so many years over two different shows. And I'm wondering, in a way, did that become kind of part of a family?
It did. That's a great question. I mean, I didn't exactly know my dad. So having an 11-year relationship with John Mahoney as my father was my relationship with my father. I mean, I didn't really have a relationship with my brothers. They were half brothers. My relationship with David Hyde Pierce was my brother relationship. And that was a wonderful thing to get vicariously through the experience of the work. That was a very good thing for me. And we dive into these experiences and basically live them, by loaning ourselves to them.
But you were also in a lot of pain while you were having that other experience. I mean, you're very honest about it in the book, and I think you have been also elsewhere. You were dealing with some serious addiction during a period of that time. And just hearing you, reading you sort of describe like how you were able to kind of function even at the depths of that is like, I found myself wondering, like, how are you still here?
Well, it's interesting. It's a question that comes up with a lot of people. And it probably goes back to that thing we were talking about before. You just don't get to quit. I mean, because I feel like it would be kind of an insult to my sister, the life that was taken from her, to not live this life fully. That's all, What
do you think finally helped you to close that chapter?
Yeah. Some of it was just a surrender to the idea that, well, you know what? Stay in this and walk this path and see what happens. I wasn't actually determining that I was going to expect a certain result, but that it was worth the journey, and staying on it was more important than stepping off. And then I had I don't know what happened. I mean, it might have been my heart attack, honestly, where I just suddenly thought, because I wasn't practicing anything then. I wasn't abusing anything at the time. I may have been working out too hard that day, but that was the one that said, "What do you want to do? You want to stay in this and feel this way, or do you want to get out and feel something else?" And so I got out and felt something else, and I found love in a new family, and it would never make me. I would never want to hurt my children from previous relationships by saying, I found something that I didn't have there, but it just became different, and it became worth living for.
Oh, that's lovely. I do want to ask you it's my understanding from the book that one of the people who killed Karen is still alive and has been up for parole a number of times. Can you foresee that? This person?
I do. I often put myself in that. It gets released. I mean, the characterization of what, there's a basic human impulse these days where, I don't know, maybe it's political, maybe it's not, maybe it's just, but there is a thing like the accused, the criminal is favored. Okay, that could happen. That could happen. It's a devastating thing to think about. But I have to be able to come to terms with it if it's something that does happen, because I know that, our society's gotten to a place where it might be that they actually feel sorry for him. And okay, I mean, I kind of get it.
But do you feel that the person who killed your sister has remorse?
He has said so. And that would make a big difference. But then he also, at the same time, in the last parole hearing, he actually said he didn't think he raped her. He didn't remember raping her. He didn't think he had done that.
Oh my!
And so it was blindingly, suddenly useful to me that I had read the police report at that time. And one of the witnesses said his words, the last words Karen ever heard were, "Tilt your head back." And I thought, you know what? I got ammunition. That's ammunition. And I'd never heard that phrase before. It was part of one of the killer's statements who turned state's evidence. But it was such a shock to me to hear it myself, and then to realize that I used it myself to keep him in jail. So it was a power in a lot of ways.
In the book, you write to Freddie Glenn, who is one of the people who killed your sister, and you say, "We share a prison, Freddie, a prison you made. Our prison. It need not be Karen. She is free. You and I may share it forever, but now telling her story releases me." That is a very beautiful passage, but do you feel released?
Yeah. Yeah, it did. It made me realize that I no longer have to occupy the prison that I had built as a result of the one he had built. And in my imagination, his is one he can remain in, and mine I don't have to anymore. The walls have been knocked down. They've opened up. It's all in that place of freedom you find when the charge is taken off of something, but the grief will never actually disappear. But the horror of what happened to Karen is now eclipsed by how wonderful she was. And that's a lot of freedom.
Wow. Do you have someone in mind that you hope will find this book?
Yeah. Anyone who's suffered a similar kind of event, anyone who's lost, and any human being, we hear about them every day. Someone's lost their child. That's just, it's remarkable. And the pain, I can't imagine, but the idea was if there's anything I can do to help you, if there's anything, if this book can bring your grief, which is going to be constant for the rest of your life, and hard and like a companion you really, really wish you didn't have. If I can give you anything that will square the grief to the joy that you got from knowing that person, at least square it up. Maybe it goes a little advantage toward the joy, but if you can get to square, then I did my job.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me. To the degree that you can even envision that, what might be next? I mean, you've already lived so many lives. I mean,
Right,
the fact is, this incredible TV character who will live with us forever.
Right.
As long as there are reruns, and people like a whole new generation is discovering your work in that realm. And then now what might be next? What are you thinking about?
Well, I've got this new version of Frasier that's actually, it's kind of on the bubble, but there's a lot of people who are interested in seeing it continue to the point where it'd be the first time a character has actually been in 3 major shows for the duration of the show, the growth period for the character. Right now, the third one is it's kind of like a fledgling show. It just started. But that show just started. There are some people who are interested in maybe seeing it go further. I'm certainly one of them. That'd be fascinating to me because the maturation of this character, matches my own, which has been kind of fascinating to finally become a great dad. That's sort of where Frasier's headed. So that's where I'm headed, hopefully. I mean, there's more writing to do now that I've discovered this. There was a whole bunch of stuff I didn't include in the book because it wasn't really connected to Karen. And I thought the things that were sort of contextual and maybe significant for my growth and her growth at the same time, that's what I wanted to put in the book. And then and the survival part of it, yeah. But this is Karen's homage, an homage to my sister, to her, to bring her back into membership with this community, with the world, and, this plane. And I think I've succeeded in that. And I know that the most important thing I got was one of my first friends read through the, first draft and said, "Wow, I think I know your sister."
Wow.
And that's what it was about.
Kelsey Grammer, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thanks, Michelle. Thank you very much.